Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the man who defeated all rivals to become the sole ruler of the Roman world and who would go on to become the first Roman emperor under the name Augustus, is certainly one of the most important and influential people in all of Roman history. When studying such renowned figures, there's a natural tendency to pile up an account of great deeds, battles won, offices held, laws passed, policies enacted. So it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they were also human beings. So, before I launch into the story of Octavian's impressive achievements, let's consider what is known about Octavian the man. For example, some specific details do survive regarding his appearance. Although his body was well proportioned, at less than 5 feet 7 inches tall, he was self-conscious about his height. Because of this, Octavian habitually wore sandals that were constructed with extra thick soles in order to make himself appear taller. The hair on his head was yellowish and curly, and his eyebrows met above his nose, giving him a unibrow. He was plagued throughout his life by a sickly constitution, and he suffered from recurrent kidney stones. In old age, his teeth became badly decayed, and he lost many of them. What of his personal habits? We know that Octavian took great pleasure in gambling and dice games, but was an abstemious drinker, rarely having more than 3 cups of water mixed with wine at dinner. He preferred to eat modest, simple foods and dressed in unostentatious clothes sewn by the female members of his family. He enjoyed collecting rarities and apparently possessed an assemblage of dinosaur bones, although at the time these were thought to be the remains of giants and mythological monsters. He was a superstitious man, always carrying around on his body a piece of seal skin as a magic amulet that would protect him from thunderstorms. He believed that if he started a long journey in a light rain, this would guarantee a speedy return. Conversely, if he accidentally put his right foot into his left shoe when getting out of bed in the morning, he viewed it as a bad omen. In his speech, Octavian was known to employ a number of unusual expressions, such as, "quicker than asparagus can be cooked," to mean doing something quickly, or "let us be content with this Cato," to mean to be satisfied with what one currently has. Thus, even the all-powerful ruler of the Roman world fretted about his appearance, had ordinary hobbies, and possessed idiosyncratic mannerisms. The greatest challenge now facing Octavian was how to permanently consolidate power in a way that would be palatable to the Romans. In order to learn some behaviors to avoid, he could look to the negative model of his immediate predecessor, Julius Caesar, who had been in a similar position of one-man rule. From Caesar's example, Octavian knew that he could not act arrogantly, nor openly disrespect the Senate, nor show contempt for the traditional institutions of the Republic. He could not monopolize offices like the consulship. And above all, he had to avoid appearing too much like a king. Caesar had done all of these things, and the result had been his assassination. On January 13th, 27 BC, at a meeting of the Senate, Octavian began revealing his response to this challenge. He theatrically announced that he was returning all of his accumulated power to the Senate and people of Rome. In what was likely a prearranged performance, he was then reluctantly persuaded to retain control over a few of the provinces: Syria, Gaul, Cilicia and Asia Minor, Egypt, and the 2 provinces of Hispania. But even these he did not rule directly, instead delegating his power to legates who acted as the governors of these regions. He had already held a number of consecutive consulships and would continue to do so for a few more years. But most of the government offices, including the majority of the provincial governorships, would now be filled in the traditional way, through election, or else with candidates chosen by the Senate. While on the surface it might appear that he was surrendering power, the reality was quite different. It's no coincidence that the handful of provinces that remained under Octavian's direct control were precisely those which contained the overwhelming majority of the Roman army. Under this arrangement, fully 23 of Rome's 28 legions would be commanded by men who had been hand-picked by Octavian and whose allegiance lay first and foremost with him. Often, ultimate power in a state resides with the person or institution who commands the loyalty of the troops, and the creation of these so-called imperial provinces ensured that if it came to the use of open force, Octavian would be the victor. Thus, military power formed one leg of the structure that would support Octavian's new system of government. A second had already begun to be implemented in 30 BC, when he had arranged for the Senate to bestow upon him the powers of a tribune, but not the actual office of tribune itself. The tribuneship was one of the traditional offices in the Roman government, and 10 of these magistrates were elected by the citizen body every year. Among their important powers were the ability to convene the citizen voting assembly and propose new legislation to it, and the power to effectively veto almost any government act or law. Tribunes also enjoyed a special sanctity in Roman culture, intended to protect them from harm when in performance of their duties. In 29 BC, in addition to the tribunician power, Octavian was granted the power of censor. Censors in the Roman Republican government not only had the responsibility to conduct the census, but also to revise the list of citizens and to add or remove individuals from the rolls based on various criteria, including a subjective assessment of their supposed moral character. Octavian would eventually amass the powers of additional magistracies until it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that the powers collectively wielded by him equaled those of the entire rest of the state. This strategy of being granted the powers of certain offices, but crucially not the offices themselves, was a brilliant innovation. It meant that on a day-to-day basis, it appeared as if everything was business as usual in the Roman Republic. The people continued to elect officials as they had done for centuries, and those officials exercised power and seemed to run the government. Yet, lurking behind this superficially republican system was Octavian, and if anything ever happened that he did not like, he could pop up and exercise one of his many powers to arrange matters to his satisfaction. However, the very fact that he was not one of the official magistrates at any given time, and that he was not constantly seen to be wielding power, had the practical effect of lulling the people into believing that he was not really in control. Now, to a modern observer, this may seem a tenuous fiction for the Romans to have bought into. But for a people weary of decades of brutal civil strife, it was a falsehood that they were willing to accept. This policy had the additional benefit that Octavian was not monopolizing the higher offices of government, and thus Roman aristocrats could go on competing with one another for them as they always had, and again could perhaps convince themselves that the structure of the Roman Republic still existed. A third leg supporting Octavian's settlement concerned the difficult question of finding a name or title by which to call himself. While in reality his position was monarchical, he obviously could not openly label himself a king. Octavian briefly considered taking the name Romulus after the legendary founder of Rome, but rejected this idea because Romulus himself had been a king, and so that association would be too close for comfort. Julius Caesar's response to this issue had been to adopt the title of dictator for life. But while the office of dictator had indeed existed during the Republic, it had been strictly limited to a 6-month term. Thus, to create a dictator for life was to directly contradict the most fundamental characteristic of the original office, and once again was too obviously equivalent to being a king. To solve this vexatious dilemma, Octavian turned to his facility at propaganda and devised a remarkably clever solution that, while actually being innovative, gave the appearance of simply following established traditions. What he did was to take on not just one name or title, but a plethora of them, each of which individually didn't seem that intimidating or autocratic, but which collectively bestowed unprecedented status and prestige upon him. Additionally, all of these names or titles either had Republican precedents or were based on long-standing cultural concepts, so that it seemed that Octavian was being respectful of tradition, even if, in his version, these same terms took on additional or novel meanings. One of the most interesting of these was the title of Augustus, bestowed upon Octavian by vote of the Senate after his supposed abdication of power in 27 BC. Again, he had probably arranged behind the scenes for this to happen, but he could publicly claim that the Senate had spontaneously granted him this title in gratitude for his actions. The term Augustus was a traditional one that had an interestingly ambiguous set of meanings related to religion. On the one hand, to describe someone as Augustus simply indicated that he was a deeply pious individual who was filled with respect for the gods. On the other hand, to label someone as Augustus implied that he himself was holy or deserving of religious veneration. The duality of this term, somehow projecting modesty while also singling out its object as nearly a divine being, is typical of the extraordinary facility that Octavian possessed for manipulating words and images in order to promote himself and his reign. It has become a convention for historians, when describing the career of this man, to refer to him as Octavian during the first stage of his life up to 27 BC, but then to switch to calling him Augustus once he'd effectively become the sole ruler of the Roman world. I'm going to follow this practice as well, so that from now on I will be calling him Augustus. Augustus also began to use the honorific princeps civitatis, which roughly translates as first citizen. Like the word Augustus, this term embodies contradictory meanings that can be viewed, alternatively, as expressions of modesty or of self-aggrandizement. On the surface, by labeling himself as the princeps, Augustus just seemed to be stressing his identity as an ordinary Roman citizen. However, the term suggested that he was not merely a citizen, but the first citizen, hinting at a special or elevated status. Occasionally, princeps is translated into English as the phrase first among equals, an inherently oxymoronic construction that nicely captures its dual nature. Princeps is the root of the English word prince, and the form of government that Augustus established is sometimes referred to as the Principate. One title that Augustus adopted had old Republican precedents, and this was the term imperator. It had long been the custom for a general to be hailed with shouts of imperator after a notable battlefield victory. But Augustus now took on this originally spontaneous acclamation as a permanent part of his formal name. While the word Augustus associated him with religion, the title imperator emphasized his role as a successful military leader. By the way, it is from the Latin term imperator that the modern English words emperor and empire are derived. So that when we speak of Roman emperors, we are simply picking out one of their many titles and using it as a shorthand for all of them. Finally, Augustus also had bestowed upon him the title Pater Patriae, meaning father of the country. While the translation of this title is straightforward, once again, its connotations are more complex. One stereotype associated with fathers is that they love and protect their children, and so giving Augustus the title of father of the country merely seems like a warm and fuzzy acknowledgement that he cared deeply about his metaphorical children, the Roman people. However, keep in mind that in Roman culture, the father was a figure of enormous authority and dignity who wielded absolute power over the members of his family, up to and including the ability to sell his children into slavery or even to kill them. Thus, Octavian's inspired solution to the dilemma of what to call himself was to take no single name or title, but instead to conceal his power behind a host of them, none of which individually seemed that excessive, but each of which highlighted a different component of his power. All of these terms became not only parts of his title, but components of his actual name, and subsequent emperors would follow his lead and call themselves by the same constellation of terms. The fourth and final component of his successful solution to the challenge of how to rule Rome as one man centered around his personal behavior. In this realm, he was clearly thinking of the animosity that Julius Caesar had provoked by his arrogant and autocratic manner. And so Augustus made a great show of trying to demonstrate his modesty. Rather than living in a lavish palace, as we might expect, instead, he inhabited a house of modest size. Rather than wearing jewels or ornate robes, he dressed in a simple toga, like every other citizen. Rather than indulging in extravagant feasts, he dined on ostentatiously simple foods, like a Roman farmer. Rather than lording it over the members of the aristocracy, he treated senators with respect and courtesy. Content with possessing real power, he apparently did not feel the need for luxuriating in its superficial trappings. Augustus's calculatedly unpretentious behavior helped to sustain the fiction that he was not, in fact, an absolute monarch. And it worked. Whereas Julius Caesar had been assassinated after only a few years, Augustus enjoyed a long reign of almost half a century and ultimately died of natural causes. One of the most interesting issues concerning Augustus is how to evaluate his establishment of the Principate. Did he, for all practical purposes, destroy the Roman Republic and its government? Or, as he claimed, did he simply restore it when it was in need of rejuvenation? Similarly, with his settlement of the Roman state, was he an innovator who created completely new institutions? Or was he primarily a traditionalist who merely adapted and updated old forms for the current situation? These are questions that historians have argued about for centuries, and there may be no truly right or wrong answer to them. What do you think? Which side of this issue would you come down on? Destroyer or restorer? Innovator or traditionalist? Or perhaps to cut to the most fundamental aspect of his rule, in the end, would you say that Augustus was indeed a king? Did his systematic monopolization of real power amount to his being a near absolute monarch? Or do you believe that the institutions of the Republic continued to function in a meaningful fashion under his rule? Certainly at the time, many Romans seemed to go along with the idea that he was a traditionalist who had restored and saved the Republic during a time of crisis. And this was the official story that Augustus himself strongly advocated. A fascinating document survives that encapsulates his version of events. This is Augustus's own autobiography, composed by him and engraved on stone tablets that were erected outside his mausoleum. Now, if you had conquered the entire world, what title would you give your autobiography? Probably something fairly grandiose. But with typical, calculated modesty, Augustus entitled his autobiography The Res Gestae, which can be loosely translated as some stuff I did. Let me read you the beginning of this document. At the age of 19, on my own initiative and expense, I raised an army with which I successfully defended the liberty of the Republic when it was oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. If a modern historian were writing Augustus's history, he might rephrase this to say, at the age of 19, I raised a private army to fight a civil war against the lawfully elected magistrates of the state. But Augustus's version sounds much more heroic. Of his settlement of 27 BC, he states, after defeating these enemies and at a time when by universal consent I was in complete control of affairs, I then transferred the Republic from my power to the control of the Senate and people of Rome. For these services, I was named Augustus by decree of the Senate, who also proclaimed that a golden shield should be fixed over my door, proclaiming my courage, generosity, justice, and piety. After this time, I surpassed everyone else in influence, although I had no more official power than those who were my colleagues in the various magistracies. Now, in this passage, note how he emphasizes that he supposedly only held power by universal consent, and also that he had no more official power than his fellow office holders. While technically true, the real issue was that he held the power of all the different magistracies, not just one of them. Another interesting passage in the Res Gestae is a section in which Augustus brags not about the titles or honors that he has earned, but instead about those that he has turned down. He boasts, After I had celebrated 3 triumphs, the Senate decreed yet more triumphs in my honor, all of which I declined. Both the Senate and the people offered to make me dictator, but I refused it. They offered to make me consul for the rest of my life, but I refused it. I would not accept any office inconsistent with the customs of our ancestors. The Res Gestae is a brilliant work of propaganda that perfectly captures the adroit way in which Augustus exploited language in order to promote his reign and his version of events. For obvious reasons, no one at the time dared to openly contest Augustus's assertion that the Republic still existed, and had merely undergone a needed restoration under his direction. It would be a full 2 centuries before we have a surviving account of Augustus that openly dared to label him a king. Around 200 AD, a Roman historian named Cassius Dio composed a history of Rome that included Augustus's reign. Dio described in detail the various titles and offices that Augustus held, and then offered this blunt assessment. In this way, the power of both Senate and people passed entirely into the hands of Augustus, and from this time there was, strictly speaking, a monarchy, for monarchy would be the truest name for it. The name of monarchy, to be sure, the Romans so detested that they called their emperors neither dictators nor kings nor anything of the sort. Yet, since the final authority for the government devolves upon them, they must needs be kings. By virtue of these democratic-sounding titles, the emperors have clothed themselves with all the powers of the government to such an extent that they actually possess all the prerogatives of kings except their paltry title. In terms of Augustus's foreign policy, the rapid expansion of the empire's borders that had characterized the previous centuries largely stopped. In general, Augustus concentrated more on solidifying what Rome already had than on gaining new lands. The civil wars had generated a huge number of legions, and one of Augustus's greatest initial challenges was what to do with these hordes of soldiers who were all looking to him to reward their service. He reduced the number of legions to 28 and discharged hundreds of thousands of veterans. Most of them were awarded grants of land and settled as farmers in a series of colonies that Augustus established all over the Mediterranean. This transformed them from being a drain on the economy into productive citizens. And they also furthered the process of Romanizing the foreign territories that Rome had acquired. Rome now controlled a continuous ring of peaceful provinces circling all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. Augustus also revised the bloated rolls of the Senate, reducing its membership by several hundred down to about 600. His one major attempt to expand the borders of the empire resulted in one of Rome's greatest military disasters. Across the Rhine River from the provinces of Gaul lay the territory of Germania, inhabited by warlike tribes. And during Augustus's reign, the Romans periodically made incursions into this region. In 9 AD, 3 legions under the command of a Roman general named Verus were sent on such an expedition. Unfortunately for the Romans, Verus had made his reputation in the law courts, not on the battlefield. And he was a thoroughly incompetent general, as well as a gullible person. A German nobleman named Arminius, who had pretended to be an ally of Rome, lured Verus and his 3 legions into an ambush in the dense Teutoburg forest. The Romans fought best on open ground, where their discipline gave them an advantage. But Verus was enticed into the swampy, thickly wooded forest, where Arminius's men were able to attack the disordered Roman formations. Varus and all 3 legions were wiped out. This was an embarrassing defeat, and Augustus took the loss of the legions hard. One source tells us that for the rest of his reign, he was prone to banging his head against the wall while moaning, "Varus, give me back my legions." The Varian disaster was a rare blot on Augustus's long and successful reign. The political system that he devised would be emulated by subsequent Roman emperors for the rest of Roman history. Augustus would become the paradigm of the good emperor, against whom all later emperors, both those of Rome and other cultures, would be measured. Augustus liked to view himself as a second founder of Rome after Romulus, and there is truth to this image, since he was indeed the father of the Roman Empire. For this alone, he is rightfully regarded as one of the most important figures in Roman history. For all his brilliance, however, there was one area in which his policies would fail disastrously, and that was when it came to the task of choosing a successor. Like his system of government, the method that Augustus adopted in selecting who would follow him as emperor would also be imitated for centuries, with the result that Rome would have to endure a number of incompetent and even mentally unbalanced leaders, an issue that we will explore in the next lecture.